So I'm delighted to introduce you to our speaker today for the Cambridge Heritage Research Centre's annual Heritage Lecture, Professor Michael Herzfeld, who'll be speaking on the topic of material ghosts, resurgent social relations, and the organisation of lived space. Michael is a man who probably needs no introduction, but I will be providing one anyway. He is the Ernest E. Monrad Research Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard University and an IIAS Professor of Critical Heritage Studies Emeritus at Leiden University. Michael has published 12 books, most recently Subversive Archaism, Troubling Traditionalists, and the Politics of National Heritage. He is an expert in social anthropology and heritage studies, focused in particular on Greece, Italy, and Thailand, where his current research addresses heritage politics, crypto-colonialism, and artisans' practices of competition and cooperation. Starting off as an archaeology and anthropology undergraduate student here at the University of Cambridge, Michael then went on to obtain an MA in modern Greek studies from Birmingham and a DPhil in social anthropology from Oxford. He also has a Michael Herzfeld unofficial fan page on Facebook with over 500 followers. Initially focused on Greece and Italy, Michael didn't move to Thai studies until later in his career, deciding it was time to take on the Thai language at the age of 50 years old. And he was successful with a grasp not only of the Thai language, but also of Thai gesture, having been told by a food vendor in Bangkok that he also looks Thai. For any of you who are a bit confused as to why someone might say that, you can read all about it in Michael's paper, Cultural Politics of Gesture. In any case, Michael has added Thai to a long list of languages that he can speak on top of those that he's currently learning. I'm not sure I can think of anyone else with expertise in Greece, Italy, and Thailand, let alone anyone who's drawn convincing connections between them. And today you'll get an example of just that, as Michael will be bringing together perspectives from Bangkok and Rome. So on that note, and without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Herzfeld.
Thank you very much, Alisa. That was a lovely introduction, perhaps the nicest one I've ever had. And it's great to be here. I'd like to thank Jesus College for providing the context and the Heritage Studies Center for their hospitality. Today, I'm not actually going to talk about ghosts so much as spectral presences. And what I want to emphasize at the outset is that I do not see or believe in a distinction between the material and the immaterial, or in the immortal bad language of UNESCO, intangible and tangible. Everything is intangible in the sense that we are unable to grasp it fully. That is the nature of human cognition. And everything is also tangible in the sense that it is real, because if it were not real, it would not be worth our while even bothering to study it. So I hope that both the postmodernists and the objectivists who might be in the audience are reeling in defeat, because if not, the ghosts may come out of the screen after all and get them. The focus of this lecture is obviously on heritage. I'm not going to use the word heritage very much because I think it's going to be the ghost in the room, in fact, and you'll see why. What I'm particularly interested in trying to say something comprehensive about is the idea that all of us today live in nation states. Most of us live in countries that are dominated by some kind of institutional religion, sometimes several. And those two forces, along with the neoliberal economy or one of its close and equally evil cousins, have done a great deal to erase the traces of prior ways of organizing social space. Anthropologists, of course, have been interested in the organization of space for a very long time, and much of what they say about topics like kinship and belief and so on is about a spatialized kind of knowledge. But think about some of the traces that prior polities leave. And I like that word polity because it gets us away from thinking that the nation state is the only kind of polity that we can embrace or we can understand. So, for example, kinship organization. In Greece, as in much of Europe, patrilineal kinship has pretty much disappeared as a major force, except in a few remote villages, one of which was the site of my probably most extensive fieldwork, and certainly the longest lasting association through fieldwork, a place I still visit 50 years after I originally went there. Nearly 50 years, it's 49 to be precise. What we find there is an organization of by clans, by patrilineal clans. When I first went there, I almost felt that I'd walked into a European edition of Evans Pritchard's The Nua, because much of the social organization actually turned out to have a lot in common with the Nua. And this, in large measure, I think, had to do with the fact that they had very similar subsistence economies. What that clan structure, however, has enabled the inhabitants of the village to do, and this is a topic I develop in my book, Subversive Archaism, is to branch out into other fields, drug smuggling, gun running, various other sorts of activities that are seen with deep disapproval by the state, because clan organization allows you to organize over much larger areas. And it also represents, and this is where the subversive archaism comes in, connections with an ancient Greece that, despite all of its archaeolatria, of its love of the ancient world, the Greek state would really rather forget, precisely because it becomes the enabling structure for activities that contradict the ideology and values of the state. But there are many other such examples. Nomadism, of course, itself offers various kinds of uses of space that seem to represent a different sort of political organization. And this is why many nation states try very hard to sedentarize anyone who is of no fixed address, so to speak. In Southeast Asia, the very common phenomenon of nation states trying to shut down Swidden agriculture that used to be known as slash and burn, and that tells you something about what even anthropologists thought about it in the old days, now widely recognized by anthropologists to be ecologically viable, but thought by the state to be risky because people then end up crossing borders, and especially old Cold War borders that still exist in Southeast Asia and in Southeast Europe. In Southeast Europe, they've sort of disappeared, but there's still that degree of suspicion between, especially the Slavic countries bordering Greece and the Greeks themselves. And one that I will talk about in more detail a bit further on, the mandala-shaped polity, the idea of a polity that essentially represents the projection of a cosmological diagram on the ground and organizing the way people live. In Europe and the Near East, we see the term poli in modern Greek still means city, but it doesn't mean exactly what the ancient Greek word polis meant. It is now really just a city, whereas in ancient Greek it was more of a polity. It was a well-organized entity that included all of the functions we think of as belonging to a large-scale organization, but in which still one saw much more mingling of economic, religious, and political activities than is tolerated in most modern industrialized nation states today. And then, of course, the Byzantine Empire, which took over from that cultural nexus, leaving the Greeks of today still thinking of the city, not as Athens. People always think it's Athens, but it's actually Istanbul or Constantinople, the city, the capital of the old East Roman Empire, a haunting presence in itself, in that in 1922, the Greeks launched a war to try to take it back, failed abysmally, and are still suffering in some ways the consequences of that. In Italy, the Roman notion of civitas, of an organized polity, was not, again, exactly the same as the modern state. It was moving in that direction, I think. But there is a modern notion that is etymologically related to it, civiltà, which the late Sidel Silverman pointed out, is actually an ideology of how to be a good and well-educated and and sophisticated person that subsists even in the remotest villages. It makes Italy in that sense very different from Greece. And not to be confused with the idea of Romanity, Romanness, or Romanità, coined by Mussolini, which is still a focus of far-right groups in Italy. I remember vividly going to the tomb of Julius Caesar in the Forum and finding that people were actually leaving offerings on the tomb. So the ghost was definitely being conjured up there. Okay, so these are the, okay. Now, much of what I'm going to talk about is about cities, but there are also plenty of rural examples, and I just want to mention Ana Mariela Bacigalupo's work, especially in Chile among the Mapuche, where she talks about how the understanding of space is very much related to the feeling that the mountains themselves are animated in some ways, and natural features are animated. And that this actually allows the Mapuche to conceive of a world in which their polity has a tangible or tangibilized existence, and that allows them also to undermine and resist the control by the Chilean nation state, which is very Eurocentric in its origins. Sometimes the traces of older polities are quite small and pathetic even. There was a man in Shanghai who was evicted. His building was, the place where his building had been was covered with a very wide sidewalk in front of some very imposing modern multi-story buildings, high-rise buildings, mostly malls of some sort. So he would bring his deck chair every day and sit in that space because he had nowhere else to go anyway. And the police, even in China, were very reluctant to move him because there was a lot of sympathy. But the danger that he represented of the state was precisely in reminding people that the state was in the process of trying to organize the living space of people in order thereby to change their social relationships. And this is something that's been going on very much in China. Another example of this are the famous nail houses. Those are houses that actually survive. They're houses that somehow people manage to maintain even as big roads, new big buildings spring up around them. They are signs of a resistance that, for various reasons, the state is reluctant to face down. But the interesting thing is that the mandala-shaped polity in Southeast Asia, even though it is treated with great respect as part of the Hindu-Buddhist traditions of the area, is also a threat to the nation state. And we'll see why that is so later on. Other examples of persistent spatiality that comes from a source not particularly friendly to the current official ideology. In Algeria, Joël Balou, who is herself of Algerian Jewish descent, went to visit the compound where her family had lived along with a Muslim extended family, and found that the Muslim family had kept the space pretty much as it was, in part because they had wonderful memories of the coexistence of two families representing two religious groups that were now, in the official view, pretty much at war with each other. In Athens, as Eliana Yalouri has shown, and others also, even though nobody, well, I won't say nobody is worshipping the ancient gods, because some of the extreme rightists have actually started to revive the worship of the 12 Olympians on the Acropolis Hill. But the space is imbued with a kind of sacredness, and people actually talk about it as a sacred space without really relating it to the concepts of their currently dominant religion, namely Orthodox Christianity. So one wants to know what actually is it that they're finding here, and that they're living. One hint we might get is by looking at what happened in Warsaw, where after the destruction of the ghetto by the Nazis, of course, there was a lot of physical destruction as well as the destruction of the population. If you walk around in that area today with any knowledgeable Warsaw person, whether that person be Jewish or Catholic or whatever, they have an uncanny, and I will use that word uncanny knowingly here, ability to find their way in streets that no longer exist, marking out a space that becomes increasingly at odds with the increasingly nationalistic and Catholic-centered right-wing government of Poland. And finally, an example from Rome, and I'll show you some pictures in a moment. An archaeologist, friend of mine, living in the same street where I was living when I did my field work in Rome, insisted that I won't say modern houses, but the palazzi, as they're called, the apartment houses of the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, were structured exactly like the ancient insulae, which were essentially tenement blocks. And that part of Rome, which is now heavily gentrified, had actually been where the riffraff lived. It was the red light district of Rome from at least the time of Augustus and probably earlier, all the way up to the present day. In fact, one of the last, the dernier cri, if you will, of prostitution in this district was when the police were called by an outraged new resident who discovered that next to his house was a bordello. And so they came and they arrested the madam and one woman who I think was not actually local, but she was working for the madam. The madam was 83 years old and the other woman was 78. I think we can just leave that hanging in the air with all of the obvious significance it has. Now, the anthropologist Adam Yue Chow has argued that the Chinese government, when it wants to expel people, uses this character, which basically says demolition, and what he discovered was that people living there in these areas, and this is something that's done in many cities of China now, develop very uncomfortable feelings. He attributes this to the idea that simply they are being threatened. I suspect that it also has something to do with the feeling that if they give in to the threats, they are also deserting something that is very near and dear to them, and that they have not been thinking about all that consciously until forced to move away from it. This at least is what I want to suggest. Back to Rome, where echoes of antiquity are part of the picture, but so are echoes of a certain kind of religiosity. So here is the name of this famous red light district, Suburra, which in ancient Latin had two R's, and in modern Italian has two R's, but in the Romanesco dialect is Suburra. It's just one R, not Suburra. So what does this mean? Well, it's interesting that whoever put this monument or made this monument was acting on the orders of a pope, Alexander VI, the famed libertine Borgia pope, who is actually thought to be the direct lineal ancestor of many of the inhabitants of Monte today, who knows? The church, of course, vehemently denies that this is possible, but the presence there of this memory that there was some other way of spelling the name of the place, and it had some other kind of significance, and is associated with this pope, who is now seen as one of the most immoral representatives of his church, I think is very suggestive. And what it suggests, I think, will become apparent in a moment. The Madonnelle, the little medallions of the Virgin, often with the child, and sometimes also with Joseph, the Madonnelle, you would think, are signs of great piety. But as others have pointed out before me, in fact, they really almost mean the opposite. These Madonnelle were shrines to which people who were embarrassed to go to church because they were such petty crooks of one sort or another, whether they were prostitutes or petty thieves or lock pickers, or a whole range of things that were associated with this district. It's no coincidence that the two districts that have the largest concentration of these medallions are Monte and Trastevere, which are the two areas that were the least, shall we say, respectable throughout Rome's history until about the year 2000. Then everything started to change. But Trastevere got gentrified actually quite a bit earlier, but Monte certainly only around 2000 and then very quickly when it happened. Now, the point here is that these Madonelle represent a form of worship that is not recognized by the church, except in a very generic sense. The church actually tried to organize pilgrimages to go to each one of these Madonelle in a series, looking very much like the Stations of the Cross. The priest was trying to make a new interpretation of the space of the district to make it seem as if it was a Christian space imbued with the spirit of the Stations of the Cross. But most people in Monti still remember that they went to this or that Madonna to pray that she would intercede with this particular August College, what an appropriate thing to mention, with her son to help them get over the consequences of their sinfulness. So these medallions are actually more of a sign of sinfulness than they are of piety. And this fits a very popular interpretation of the Catholic doctrine that says, of course, that all human beings are sinners by definition anyway. Now, I am not going to torture you with pictures of food, but this is from my film Roman Restaurant Rhythms, and I wanted simply to show you how different kinds of tradition come together. And what you're going to be seeing is a member of the Jewish community of Rome. And remember, the Jews were brought to Rome in AD 70 as slaves. That's still the basis, apparently, of the population, now much dispersed, of the Jewish population of Rome. But she is singing about, in a very popular way, about a number of rather well-known characters from ancient history. So I hope I can make it work. Yes. Not very well, but...
Sono romano, veramente me ne vanto. Sono romano, puro sangue e so contento. Sono romano come l'aria, il sole e il vento, che sono il simbolo di questa gran città. Sono romano e te lo dico chiaro e tonno, e di questo so sicuro e sai perché? Perché il nonno di mio nonno aveva il nonno che giocava con Nerone a Garaghè. Sono romano e quindi so conquistatore, sia nel campo battagliero che in amore. C'ho un cugino che faceva il gladiatore, come vedi non c'è altro da spiegare. Sì, te dico che mia nonna Giovannina, quasi un secoletto prima da sposare, ha tenuto pure a Bali a Messalina, l'ha cresciuta a fichi secchi e baccalà.
So I showed you that song in part because here is somebody who represents the history of Rome, certainly in herself, in her family. She's singing in the local Roman dialect, which in Italy is, I would say, if anything, even more despised than the Cockney dialect of London is in this country. It's seen as the roughest way of speaking Italian, and she makes a boast out of it, essentially. Now, when I was doing my field work, I was assured by the owner of one restaurant on our street that the ghost of Messalina, mentioned in the song, was actually seen frequently walking along the street. Now, I never met her. I'm frankly something of a skeptic when it comes to ghost stories. But what I think all of this tells us is not so much that there's a belief in ghosts, and as an anthropologist, I'm always very suspicious of claims being able to read belief, because, you know, as Bill Robbins and Alan Rumsey pointed out, there's an opacity principle here. We don't really know what people think. We don't know what they believe, but we know what they say. And this discourse is a way of conjuring up a sense of the spectral past in order to push back against the present that is seen as invasive in various ways. She herself, I think, lives quite well, but she has been very much involved in various political movements. And in general, this kind of localism is associated with strong resistance to the power of the state from both left and right-wing groups of people. So I mentioned earlier that this archaeologist, who was actually herself Belgian, but married to an Italian, was convinced that the palazzi in the area, which actually go back to the 14th century in some cases, reproduced the form of the ancient houses. So archaeologists find themselves contributing to the stories about the production of ghostly presences in the city. And one could multiply examples of this for Rome very easily. Here is the area where the gladiators are known to have been training before they actually went into fight. That's the foreground. And behind you have, again, these 19th to 15th century palazzi that allegedly, again, reproduce this structure. This is back in Monti. There's a church there, but on the left, again, more of these buildings. And some of them are showing signs of the gentrification in progress, because what happens now is that very wealthy people are moving into the area. They love the idea of living in historic houses, because this has been, again, the neoliberal economy has pumped notional value into the idea of living in a historic house. So living in conditions that otherwise would have been treated as too crowded, as too slum-like, and would have been condemned if they had been poor people, given the right kinds of furniture, equipment, and so on, suddenly become bijou apartments sold at prices that literally went up 10 times in 1 year when I was doing my fieldwork. Other traces of that spectral past include this inscription, which is an inscription offering indulgences to anyone, and I hope you all know what indulgences are. They're essentially pieces of paper that get you time off purgatory so you can go more quickly to heaven. This actually is also the model for a bureaucratic procedure in Italy, whereby the state every so often issues a collective pardon, and you go and ask, you declare all the fines that you've accumulated up to that point. The state takes, I think it's 10% of the total from you. You are then forgiven the other 90%, and there's a piece of paper that guarantees that. Once, when I talked to one of the administrators of this process, he said, "But you know we're a Catholic country." And I said, "Oh, you mean indulgences?" He said, "Of course." He almost patted me on the head. Finally I'd understood. So there's another ghostly presence here, which is a church that in some ways has been quite venal. And what it's saying here, I'm going to translate just a part of it, but it says that this edict concedes to all the faithful of one and the other sex an indulgence of 200 days, applicable even to those souls in purgatory. It's a little like transferable frequent flyer miles, for example. Every time that devotedly and with their hearts at least contrite, they recite the litanies of the most blessed Virgin before this sacred image. So there's something being conjured up here that then has reverberations through Italian society, not only in the structures of religious practice, but also in the structures of everyday bureaucratic practice. Now, religious monuments are one thing, but little religious monuments, personal religious shrines, for example, are another. I put this slide, which is from Bangkok, in because it's from a house that is now owned by a jeweler whose family came from the northeast of Thailand, and therefore he's ethnically Thai Lao, because this house clearly originally belonged to a Chinese person. How do we know that? Well, apart from the fact that historically there were lots of Chinese jewelers who set up, goldsmiths set up business in Bangkok in the 19th century, they did not continue in that work because they made a lot of money and they became gold merchants instead. Then they had to hire people from outside. Most of them came from the northeast of Thailand, speaking this Thai Lao dialect. But they maintained the shrines because in Thai practice, the shrines are not of your own ancestors. These are shrines to the original owners of the house, the builders of the house, in a way receiving offerings to make sure that they will not interfere with these Johnnies come lately who are now living in the house or working in it. But the other interesting thing here is the cat. And we will meet more cats in this presentation in a moment, but I want you to think about what that cat might actually have been doing there. This is the Temple of the Golden Mount, a true monument in every sense of the word, but the photograph is taken from the small community of Pamahakan, where I did fieldwork from 1998, essentially 1999, sporadically until it was destroyed by official forces in 2019. And there it is, very interestingly, a break in the road, where you can see the black and white stripes on the right, very significant because this is the point of rupture between the old mandala-shaped wall that was obviously meant both to express and to contain the polity organized in the old way, with the new modern city built by the westernizing king Rama V Chulalongkorn in the middle of the 19th century, in a street named Ratadamun, which literally means the progression of the king. So you could see it either as being because the king in Western style waved to his subjects, a very Western gesture, not Thai at all, from his motor car, which at the time was the only one in Bangkok. You could translate it as King's Way, and simply as an imitation of King's Way in Britain and in many other countries that were former colonies. Thailand made concessions to the colonial powers, and especially to the British, and one of them was to behave like a modern European country, for which the British very kindly described the Siamese, as they were then known, as semi-civilized, and as they were semi-civilized, they were expected to civilize the outlying groups, such as the Thai Lao in the Northeast, and that is a lot of what's at the basis today of the class structure of modern Thailand. But the reason I put this slide in is particularly to show you that there is actually a physical trace of that rupture. And you're looking at the point where the old polity is being pushed away from the new city. Now, as with the Greek word polis, so the word Mung persisted, but changed its meaning. So when the people of this community were being pushed out, they protested saying, Rao Yunai Mung, we live in the Mung, but it's not clear what they meant. Do they mean we are participants in the modern city, or do they mean we are members of this community, this polity that predates the modern city? Given their proclivity for deliberately archaizing behavior, especially in terms of dress and in terms of their claims about heritage and tradition, I would say that they meant the latter. But it was not necessarily a clear-cut distinction for them. So we see that if we can take the definition of a polity as the way that people agree or are forced in some cases to live together, we can see in all over Southeast Asia that there has been a radical shift as the colonial model of the nation state with a capital city, which itself then became a kind of a microcosm of the country as a whole, a concentrated symbolic space. We can see how that that process happened very quickly, and the impact it had in different kinds of impact, in some cases, different countries. So I would argue that the mandala motif is indeed a spectral presence in this sense, and that it has some reality for the residents of these communities. There is an orientation to sacred sites. The fact is that these places are close to temples, and you'll see in a moment that the model for this came from the previous capital of Ayutthaya. The original intention was to build Bangkok to look exactly like Ayutthaya. And so we move from the Mern to the modern city. And just as an aside, what's interesting too is that in that process, there's been a transformation in a religious doctrine, namely the doctrine of karma, or Gam in Thai, because previously there was a doctrine that said simply you will be reincarnated according to the virtues or vices you've committed in your life. So if you are a good person, you will be reincarnated perhaps as a monk. But if you're a bad person, you may be reincarnated as a noxious animal of some sort. But what this has turned into in the modern polity is you look different from us, you're not wealthy and you dress badly and you don't speak in an elegant way, this proves that you deserve to be lower class, and it means you must have done terrible things in your previous life. So it becomes a kind of self-justifying predestination. I call it Protestant Buddhism because it speaks exactly to the way that Weber talks about the Protestant ethic in Christianity. So here is the mandala shape, and if you don't believe me, here's a Tibetan mandala, which is probably the clearest kind of diagram. You see these concentric, I'll go back to this. This is not Judea, don't be misled. This is Ayutthaya as a Dutchman understood it. So there's another bit of spectrality creeping in there from the Dutch side, but we won't go there. The community itself was full of these personal shrines. You can see one of them in the middle of that picture. There was a shrine that was said to express the entire community and to be its sacred space. When the area where this shrine stood was sequestered by the authorities and the residents beat their first retreat, they moved the shrine and they moved the symbols, and there indeed is the cat. And people will not stop the cat from going up there for the very simple reason it might be someone's grandfather. Okay. It's not funny. I mean, this is serious, you know, I see this all the time. Animals go onto these shrines and people actually will say to you, well, you know, it's fine, it's not doing any harm. And after all, it's probably somebody reincarnated. It's also, I think, a tribute to the gentleness of the people in this particular community that the cat is totally unfazed by having its picture taken. And actually, when I met cats on the pathways inside the community, they simply refused to get out of the way. They were in charge, and you know, human beings could damn well move over. Look again at these images, Buddha images for sure, but there's a couple of very interesting other things. So if you see where the arrow is in the lower picture, this is pointing to a figure you'll see in many such shrines around Thailand. It's the Jiao, best translated as Genius Loci, right? Genius of the place, the spirit of the place. And there's usually a female one as well when she's there, and they look very similar. They have a very vague identity. These are, as it were, the guardian spirits of the place itself. So when the community was pushed out of there, the assumption was that the Jiao might actually take some action against the authorities, and it didn't really happen. Behind the male is a statue of, yes, it is Rama V, the famous westernizer. So he's also a kind of spectral presence in his own way, even though it was his reforms that initiated the process of erasure of the earlier polity. And there you see the two of them more clearly. Now, if you wonder what the Mun means for people today, this was a meeting of the community, and it's interesting that people actually arranged themselves in concentric circles with the older and more senior people raised higher and the men higher than the women, because there is also a gender hierarchy there. So they actually reproduced the Mun on the ground, which is exactly what you would expect. Because as John Gray in his study of the Chetri of Nepal has pointed out, you can actually get the reproduction of the mandala in a single house. And some groups around Asia do that. This is not a reflexive, intentional reproduction of the mandala shape. It's a living out of the Mun in space. So sometimes the space after it's been cleared will not look anything like that. But if you see the people themselves gathering, you frequently, I think, will see in Thailand these kinds of meetings that look, when you see it finally, remarkably like the Mun, at least so I would claim. And the power in the center, of course, being either the president or in this case, one of the members of the committee that ran the association. Now, one of the things that these people did to fight back against the attempt, ultimately successful attempt to evict them, and one of the things that people in Rome also do when they think they're under threat of eviction, and certainly something that my shepherd friends in the mountains of Crete do when they feel that the authorities are about to chastise them for the often rather bandit-like existence they live, is to respond by demonstrating that they understand tradition, heritage better than the authorities. And it's particularly strong in countries like Greece and Thailand. You may wonder why I bracket Greece and Thailand, but these are examples of what I call crypto-colonialism. They're countries that adopted a particular style of self-governance as a protection against being invaded. And there was a tacit, or not quite so tacit, assumption that if they succeeded in adopting the civilizing mission of the West and applied it also to some of their internal minorities and neighbors, they might well be left alone by the Western powers. And it's actually what happened. And there are lots of other examples. China actually is a good example. So is Iran, Ethiopia before the Italian invasion, and so on. But here we have people who are saying, okay, we actually understand tradition, understand heritage much better than these crypto-colonial bureaucrats who are simply representing the newfangled way of doing things. And they will say, so in Crete, for example, men will say, well, we were stealing sheep 2,000 years ago, and after all, King Minos predates the Acropolis by at least 1,000 years. They are picking up bits of the discourse of the state and of the learned culture that the state has tried to make its own and throwing it back at the state and say, we do this better than you do. So the inhabitants of Pomahakam started dressing in 18th and even early 19th century costumes. They started organizing revivals of various kinds of musical performance associated with earlier phases of Thai history. The whole thing was designed to subvert the attempt of the state to control them by saying, the state knows nothing. We are loyal Thais, loyal Greeks. The Romans wouldn't say they were loyal Italians, they would say they were loyal Romans. That's a very different thing. But Italy is a much more fragmented state in that sense. So I offer here a definition, yes, it did come up, of subversive archaism from my recent book, and I'll read it in case it's not too clear for everyone. In an important sense, subversive archaism is an inversion, or perhaps a special case, of cultural intimacy. It's a way of suggesting that the state's claims to authority rest on flawed assumptions and on the tutelage of foreign powers. In beleaguered enclaves like Zonyana, a village in Crete, and Pomahakam, we find very different assumptions about what an ideal polity should be. It's a far cry from the official European-derived nation-state perspective, and the aspirations that animate it persist in collective discourse as templates grounded in historical experience. So here is an example of how a local population will essentialize heritage just as much as the state does, and very much in the way that the state does it, but claim to be doing it better, which of course is something that no state is prepared to tolerate for very long. One result was that the Pomahakam community got seriously clobbered. It actually was totally destroyed and its inhabitants scattered around. Another result was that the village, which got into some villagers got into a fight with the police, this is in Crete, and a policeman was killed, and the result was that the village was put under a sort of lockdown and humiliated. And I describe some of those reactions in the book. But I was always very impressed by the ability of the people of Pomahakam in particular to adopt the language, the symbolism, and the style of the state. So these are signs that they made. And notice that the English one actually puts a date on the house. That's 200 years old, ancient house, 200 years. The word ancient in Thai, Boran, is definitely part of the archaeological vocabulary. The Fine Arts Department, like the Archaeological Service in Greece and the Fine Arts Department in Italy, is a state within a state, very powerful. And this word Boran is being thrown back at the state. Like, we know what antiquity is all about. Look, and we also know how to produce it in our current signage. Didn't help them very much. This is the beginning of the process. You can just see the tops of the heads of the people who are actually carting off the remains of some of the houses. They destroyed all of the houses in the place. But notice on the left, a little sign. You can't see all of it, but it's pointing to a heritage museum. So that was also part of the resistance. And it was part of this attempt to try to conjure up the specter of a different kind of polity than that represented by the state. The state represents a crushing westernization, and it's very easy, therefore, to criticize the state. To be Thai in modern Thailand, you have to be Thai in a way that will fit with Western models of civilized behavior. So this is a propaganda poster from the middle of the 20th century, put out by the dictator Black People Songkhram. The people on the left, you might think, were dressed in classic Siamese costume. They are. The people on the right look as if they're dressed in basically Western colonial dress, and they are. But what the inscriptions over the top say is very revealing, because the big letters say Thai culture, and then on the left it says, don't do this, and on the right it says, do it this way. So the implication is that to be Thai, you have to be Siwilai, and they actually adopted the word from English, and being Siwilai meant then that you were self-colonizing. The poison of colonialism reached far beyond the red patches on the globe, and places like Greece and Thailand are very good examples of this. A lot of people in the establishment in both countries get very annoyed with me when I talk like this, because, of course, they were the local agents of that colonial domination. Yes, you get that as well. The contrast between those two drawings continues to be important. So here is a male member of the community doing exactly what puts fear and loathing into middle-class Bangkok sensibilities, namely wearing actually tattooed amulets. He's getting tattoos and amulets in one. And what they wanted to replace this kind of behavior by is very clear. It's a modern, Western-style industrialized park with people dressed in, yes, well, I don't think I even want to go on saying what I was about to say, and I'm showing you some details so you see the irony. And the ultimate act of civilization was to destroy what was there before, including 7 houses that experts throughout Thailand had said were beautiful illustrations of vernacular Siamese architecture. So the fury of the state, I think, represents, to my way of thinking, it shows how scared officialdom was that if this place was allowed to survive, it would infect a lot of other places making very similar claims, and Thailand would revert to something much more like its older self. Now, I am not going to claim that Thailand today is a genuine democracy. It's not, but it has the surface of a democracy, and that means it has the means to repress anything that threatens to expose the shams underneath. But strangely enough, the residents of Pamahakan did get, if not the last word, the last materiality, because they were able to place broken remains of idols, bits of cloth that had been used for ordaining trees as monks, which is a well-known practice of resistance in Thailand, in the old trees. And I'm going to mention something about the old trees again in a moment, but some of them are Bodhi trees, which means that they are descended from the tree under which the Buddha is supposed to have achieved enlightenment. There's only one major building that the authorities then put on the site. That building is a public toilet, and it doesn't even work. But they did build a shrine, and in the shrine, they put a rather expensive looking version of a Jiao Ti. I have not seen a single person from Pamahakan go there and pay respects to that Jiao Ti. The other thing they did was to officialize and bureaucratize the site. So they put on the trees, which had been mostly significant to the residents as representing, again, that old sacred order, because they were ordained as monks, and they, and again, they had this historical relationship with the enlightenment of the Buddha, with scientific names. In other words, they're being represented now as flora that are interesting. Now, the residents got interested in that idea too. So in part of their resistance was they learned to say, we have plants and trees in this enclave, very small enclave, that are actually really quite specific to it. And there may even have been some truth in that. But that was not of interest to the authorities. The authorities wanted to say, we are the guardians and protectors of all of this floral life. They also presented themselves as protectors of heritage. And they do it in Thai, English, and Chinese. And there are signs like this all over the site, showing you that there used to be a street here of charcoal burners. Over here, there was a place where they smelted gold. Over here, they were making bird cages. I have known that community long enough that I remember some of those groups of people. But this is what I call bureaucratic nostalgia. And I borrowed that term, I paraphrase that term, as it were, from Renato Rosaldo's imperial nostalgia. Rosaldo argues that the British destroyed a lot of cultural material, and in so doing, then were able to put it into museums, claiming to be commemorating the very peoples they had done so much to dislodge and destroy. This is exactly what, in pursuit of the civilizing mission, the Thai authorities are doing in this park. And to cap it all, the park is now dedicated to the Queen Mother, so you can't even criticize it because that would constitute lèse majesté, which carries a sentence of 15 years in jail. By the way, applicable to foreigners as well as to Thais, so one has to be very careful. So, finally, what can we conclude from all of this? Well, I hope that what I've shown you is that there are traces all over big cities that have unexpected reverberations, resonances of other ways of being, other ways of living. We know that this happens very easily in remote places where there are tribal groups who, such as those studied by Basigalupo, who have been able to get on with their own practices, their own understanding of the universe around them without too much interference of the state until very recently. But in big cities, this also lives on. And cities are terrifying places for many people, especially when large-scale eviction, demolition, and so on starts to kick in. So I want to conclude this talk by recommending to you the idea of studying spectrality as something to do with the contestation of lived space. And I call it the unbuilt environment because the built environment is a common phrase used by architects and planners. The point is precisely that some of those planners, especially those involved in government offices, in the bureaucracy, have unbuilt the environment and then repackaged it in their own way. And what they are not seeing is that even if they build massive structures over those spaces, local people will actually find traces of the earlier way of living, and especially traces that have to do with their social interactions with each other all over that space. So there are spoilers and there are specters. The spoilers are these modern forces, the nation state, which is a surprisingly modern phenomenon. Of course, today, China will tell you, we've been around for 5 millennia. Greece will tell you we've been around for 2 millennia. Lots of countries will tell you stories like this. They are ignoring the important changes that these spectralities, in fact, mark and celebrate. And they're ignoring the fact that their own religious institutions have also morphed into other things. They've been, as I say, Protestantized. I mentioned that earlier. I also think here of the work of Bruce Kapfra in Sri Lanka. Kapfra argues that the Theravada Buddhist religion, which actually came from Sri Lanka to Thailand, is a religion that preaches peace, but it has within it the capacity of any symbolic system to morph into something else. And this is what happens when Tamils are then, Hindu Tamils are then represented as yakitori, as evil spirits. And that explanation seems to work quite well when we look at what has been happening in Myanmar with the Rohingya, what has been happening in the deep south of Thailand as well. In other words, these peaceful Buddhists are suddenly no longer peaceful, but they don't see a contradiction because their logic has been taken up in the process of transforming their religion into a more bureaucratic order and adumbrating it to a nation-state structure that is no longer a Westphalian nation-state or post-Westphalian nation-state, but what I would call an ethno-national state, a very different kind of entity where the majority erases rather than protects its minorities. And all of this supported by current neoliberal structures in which money has become the only criterion of value, and in which, therefore, it is justified, heavy irony here, it is justified to destroy communities since those who are already wealthy, and that 1% who own, 99% of the world's wealth, are seen in this Weberian model to be deserving of their good fortune, and the rest are just in the way. But the rest know that there are those traces. They may call them ghosts, they may call them spirits, they may simply call them traces, as I'm doing here. The ghosts may be the ghosts of respected forerunners, they may be the ghosts of people they know were violators even of their own religious principles, but they know that they had a different order of existence that would not fit with the modern nation state. They still appeal to the spirits, asking them for protection for the living. Although the man who you saw in the goldsmith shop with his shrine told me that he now actually expects to get more protection from a set of Hindu deities whose images he's brought in. So these are also perceptions that change over time. But what you have been seeing is the faint, and they are faint, traces of past polities. And I think that it behooves us to remember that if we fall into the trap of making sharp distinctions between the material and the immaterial, we will forget those wispy ontologies in between the material and the immaterial, in between those two idealized poles that constitute a very important part of the reality of most of the underprivileged people who inhabit our globe. Thank you very much. Time for questions? Yes.
Michael, thank you very, very much for such a great talk. To friends here who attended this talk in person, and to all our friends who attended Michael's inspiring talk online, I would like just to say a few words on behalf of the Center for Heritage Research here at Cambridge. I'm Andreas Pantazatos, I'm one of the partners of the Heritage Center. And during the last 2 days, we have been very lucky to enjoy Michael's company. But more importantly, we have been extremely lucky and grateful for his kindness, attentiveness, and care to all our PhD students when he explained and shared his ideas about heritage ethics. And at the same time, his capacity to listen and respond greatly to all our MPhil students in heritage studies and engage with the projects and provide excellent feedback. So, Michael, thank you very, very, very much. Coming after such a great talk, I have to say one thing. I never thought in my life that bureaucracy would look so attractive. So I owe at least this to you. So what Michael reminded us today is that polity, the way people agree to live with, as Michael said, is shaped and shapes heritage in the most omnipresent way. And the way we agree to live in a shared space, also remind us that that space, ordered and or negotiated, always provides with enough reminders to look for the things that they used to be there, and also for the things that might appear in the future, even if they were buried in the past, for those who decided to do so, but also for those who decided to keep them alive. So, Michael, thank you very much. And I could not do a better favor, I think, also to thank you in Greek. Michali, ευχαριστούμε.